In this lesson, we're going to take a look at some of the display attributes of a container. Now, I'm going to continue working with the previous lesson. I've also saved this out so you can open up lesson 06 and follow along there if you'd like, or you can create your own setup and we can go from there. I'm going to go ahead and close up the contents method and then open up the display. Now, currently we're viewing this as the render. Essentially what this is saying is, here's a preview of what it would look like if you were to render this. Now, we can change this and say, you know what? I'm happy with it. I don't need to see it. Let me just turn off the display. You can turn it off. If you want to just look at the density attributes or just look at temperature, right? Now, where would this be useful? Well, let's take a look up here. Remember earlier when we were talking about some of these gradients? Well, let's say I turned on the temperature and I set this to a gradient. Well, that's really hard to see. What if I set this to a Y gradient? That's really hard to see. However, if I come down to display and say, you know what, just show me temperature. Much easier. Actually, I wanted it the other way, so we can go up and go, oh, okay, let's change this to a negative Y. There we go. That's what we want. So again, when I rewind and play this, I'm not going to see my simulation because really what's being drawn on the screen is being controlled by this display attribute. Now we can change this again to as render, to density. We could also say, you know what, show me density and temperature. And what we get is a nice ramp here that shows us low to high. And then really what's in between. So we can really quickly get in there and go, okay, let's take a look at fuel, density, and color. Show me just fuel. We don't have any fuel. That's why we're not getting a reaction. Okay, so we're going to be using this quite a bit to go in and preview what we are wanting to work on. Now, everything but as render will have an opacity preview gain. Why do we need this? Well, what this essentially does is it's kind of like levels in Photoshop. It rockets this back and forth. It's kind of like a bias, and it's it's just for preview. But what happens is sometimes you have a soft edge, and this is the default, and you're like, God, where is that particle? Is it reacting like it's supposed to? Well, you can crank this up and get a better look and go, oh, hold on, we actually have a gap right here. That's why it's not working. Okay. That does not get affected if you have as render turned on. It's disabled. Your voxel quality is by default set to faster. You could set it to better, and what it's going to try to do is show you a better representation of drawing all of the voxels a little bit more accurately, but you're going to give up a little bit of speed when you try to simulate this. So, I usually leave it to faster and let the renderer take care of it. All right, let's talk about some of these previews down here. Now this really has to do with the container, okay? So right now if we have the boundary draw set to outline, here's full, so we can actually see all of the voxels. If I set to bounding box, just like we did earlier, you can see the Z depth of that actual voxel. Or I can just disable it and say, you know what, I don't want to see the boundary at all, I just want to see my fluid simulation. So once you have things set exactly the way you want them, you could be good to go and just call it a day. All right, I'll set this back to outline. Now, there are completely different setups for 3D containers. So I'll go ahead and create a 3D container and move it off to the side. And in this 3D container, if I choose the boundary draw, you'll notice I'll have a few more options. Okay, so right now the boundary draw is done with this bottom grid that you see that represents the X and Z voxels. I could, however, say, you know what, show me reduced, which essentially looks at the camera. You notice here I'm flipping back and forth. If I move it up, I'll actually see the top. So it's really from the camera's perspective what voxels we want to preview. And that'll help you troubleshoot if you have a funky voxel somewhere in there. You can also choose outline, which is the entire outer bucket, or you can say full, which is show me every single voxel in here. So let me reduce my resolution here to something like 3 by 3 by 3, and it's a little bit easier to see now. Okay, so you can actually see the 3 by 3 voxels that are making up this fluid simulation. Again, you have the bounding box, just like you had on the 2D, or you can set it to none. I usually leave it either on bottom or reduced, just depending on what I'm working on and what I need to see. Usually bottom will be just fine. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and close that up, and I'm going to come back to my 2D container, and we'll focus our attention on this. Now, we have another option here called numeric display, and right now it's set to off. Well, if I set this to density, what I'm going to see is a lot of numbers, and they're really hard to see and distinguish here. So I'm going to reduce, again, even on this one, I'm going to reduce this down to 20 by 20. Okay, and I'll play this back. There we go. And what we're seeing here is the actual density that that actual voxel is representing. So let me just take this down to 10 by 10 so we can really see what's happening here. There we go. And you can see here that this voxel is 0.8. Here's a 0.8. Here's a 0.1. And so we can really dial into what the actual voxel's density is being reported. Now, if I change this to something like temperature, rewind and play, there is no dynamic temperature being generated in here. Okay, so again, no fuel, but if we had those simulating, we would see those. Now, this works both in wireframe and shaded. So if you're in wireframe mode or shaded mode, they'll both show up, so you can easily see that. In the wireframe display, I've got some options here that I want you to be aware of. One, you can turn them off, so if you actually do end up going to wireframe, you won't see anything. They're just invisible. By default, you're at particles, which I think they're kind of hard to see. Let me just increase my resolution again. We'll do 40 by 40, which is the default. Okay. So there goes our particles. Something else that I'd like you to be aware of is rectangles. Now, what I love about rectangles is the size of the rectangle represents how much of that voxel is being used. And so, it draws super, super fast, allowing you to do some really, really big resolutions. But it's also giving me a lot more information than just the particles. The particles, I don't know where they're belonging. I don't know where the voxels are. And so, you kind of have to pick and choose what is useful for you and what fits your need. Okay? So again, you can use them in shaded, you can use them in wireframe. If you feel your system is chugging a little bit, go to wireframe and just let it work. It's a lot faster. So you can see this simulation versus this wireframe. And it's just so much faster. Okay. Now, the other option I want to show you is this velocity draw. Now, if I activate velocity draw, what it's going to do is pull up some arrows that represent the velocity. There we go. So where are the actual particles moving? Now, you can do a couple of things here. You can essentially increase the length and say, well, let me just make these bigger so they're easier to see. Or if you have a whole bunch of them, you might want to make them smaller just so they're kind of out of the way and you can see the fluid in relation to these. You can choose to have arrows on or off. I kind of like the arrows because it points in the direction that that fluid is moving. Okay. Now, if you have a really, really complex setup, so let's say we double this to 80 by 80, that's now a lot of arrows that are being drawn in the system. So if I increase the length, it could just get hard to see, but we want this quality. Well, what we can do is reduce this or increase this velocity draw skip. So if I change this from 1 to 2, what it's saying is draw 1, skip 3, draw 1, skip 3. So I'll set this as something like 5. And yeah, I can get kind of the general idea of where the things are moving, but I'm not inundating my system with all of these arrows that I would have at default. So again, I kind of set it to what feels comfortable, how much data do I really need, and then set it to that and then leave it. Okay, so that's the display attributes. Next, we'll talk about some of the dynamic simulation attributes.